Seo Gerry Adams le Bairbre Brún, Mitchel McLaughlin agus Gerry Kelly agus bei Mitchel Yanu. Geespraak twi and go into Union Hasta. It's Gerry Adams here, and we're doing a podcast with Bairbre Brún, with Mitchel McLaughlin, and with Gerry Kelly on our reflections on the Good Friday Agreement, which of course is 25 years old. Now, in fairness, this would be a rather narrow focus on Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin's participation in this, as opposed to bringing in a broader canvas. So we will also do it in two instalments. So Gerry Kelly is a well-known escaper, former prisoner, hunger striker, MLA leader. Bairbre is a well-known leader, former MLA, former minister, and Mitchel McLaughlin is all of those things, plus he was coordinator. Were you coordinator in the Stormont?
Yes.
Yes. So he was also the speaker up at Stormont. So look, we're gonna look first of all in the years before, well before the Good Friday Agreement. And we want a wee bit of sort of interaction, so I may put a question to somebody by name, but anybody else that has an opinion or a bit of information, just jump in and say your piece. So these were desperate days. The British had militarised the situation. They were sitting on top of it. We were living under military occupation. In fact, we were part of one of the longest phases of unbroken resistance: communal resistance, personal resistance, civil resistance, armed resistance to English rule in the history of our island. And if you go back into the late 70s, the awfulness of what was going on here, and then the hunger strike. So we obviously can't get into all of that detail, but the listeners and the viewers should be mindful that a lot of this happened against the background of awful suffering, of hurt, of injury, of atrocities, and so on and so forth, and of a British and Irish government which were joined at the hip in terms of the need to coerce the risen people of the northern statehood. So Republicans started to think about, is there a way to sort this out? The word peace had been hijacked by the great and the good. So, Mitchel, maybe you give us your reflections, and then Bairbre or Gerry, or whatever order you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's arguable that the civil rights movement itself was an example, because of the support and the participation of Republicans, of a peaceful approach to civil rights and to national rights. So like innocents abroad, we all turned up and linked arms and sung Kumbaya, and we still overcome, and we got broken skulls, and we got British Army water cannon. So the state was making it very difficult to have a peaceful resolution of those kind of issues. But in my view, as the British Army were deployed, and I think you've correctly characterised their role, they were defending British interests and the British state, then that was the second birth, in my view, of Republicans identifying different forms of struggle, even in the midst of all the horror of hunger strikes and mass mobilisations and international attention. During the hunger strike, we discovered the benefits of electoralism, at least used in a tactical sense. So all of that, I think, framed the modern day republicanism and the what I think is a very consistent development of the case for national self-determination, which eventually the British government was forced to recognise.
Okay, what I should have said in my opening remarks is that what the three comrades have in common, apart from their activism, is that they were all involved in the negotiations, along with many, many others. And I'm mindful now that Martin McGuinness isn't with us, and that Siobhan O'Hanlon isn't with us, and that there are probably others who have passed on too. So Bairbre Cadachine and who Féin Major Mitchell Hui and Starshin.
I will walk Misha Gerry and Shaftaji o Walyaklia Gabel Ferrista Kager Garbas Bel Ferrista Mawar. So Honik Misha Ganam Shin grow Ruddy Gujokalat Vegriwak Fui and Walyaklia Kosulish Janga Gaelige Knock Fager Lad Vegriwak and Shaw instant doi Canon Kerner Mar Beha Tiva Weed and the norm I guess Ganyan for unseart the Haravan and Majin. A few glorch for Boctonus, Agus Coanus, Bishin few Jacker and Shaw, Agus and Major a Wahi Mesha, Teresh and Stalcockras, Agus Mujik Egrivo, Nismo, non-major George Toof and Focal Sheakan. It was very clear to me, just talking to ordinary people here, that the word peace here didn't have a positive connotation at that time, and it didn't have a positive connotation among ordinary people because it was seen as meaning their surrender and their giving up their demands for very ordinary things that they wanted and that they needed. And I thought it was really interesting the way in which people then got around that by starting to talk about peace with justice. So there was a long period from them feeling that peace was something that didn't apply to them, or certainly that they weren't going to be allowed to be part of, to being able to embrace it, because peace with justice was something they could absolutely understand. That was something that meant something very real to them. And I think then our documents that started coming out built on that, built on what had been grasped by people on the ground once they started to say they were happy with peace with justice as a concept, what that meant. And eventually we were able simply to talk about peace because by then people understood it as peace with justice. And people previously outside of Republican circles who had really only lazily in some cases seen peace as Republican surrender, or the surrender of people who were out and about on the streets looking for things, also embraced a wider version of peace and became part of that discussion.
So the Republican base, the party moved from this broad, it didn't move from it, it added to this broad culture of resistance into a culture of change, into contesting the word peace, understanding the word peace, putting, if you like, going beyond the propaganda and actually looking about what it constituted. And you mentioned Bairbre, Féin, Accormidslehela and Kibinyat and Féin.
I have draw wood Shiakana, mar hampla no scenario for peace revision. Nurali Larry Shades and Doi Heel Shade good joker le Shiakan chat in Sincere show. But I think as well when you were talking about moving to a new form of activism, it's something that Pat Bugg, God rest him, years later talked about moving out of the corner, going into a risky space in terms of taking people on in these conversations and these discussions and contesting words and what they meant and debating words and what they meant, and not just simply accepting the definitions that were being handed to us through the media or wherever else.
Okay, I'm going to come to Gerry Kelly in a second, but we took these two documents, we took them to Ardash, and that was in September 87. 87 was scenario for peace, and the lasting peace was 1992. So they actually became a peace strategy, a peace process, a peace objectives became formal Sinn Féin policy endorsed by the Ardash. Do you want to give us sort of a wee bit of an insight about how that was put together? And there was a small group. Were you involved in that, Gerry? In the prison at that time?
I was in prison.
You were in prison, so well. You might just reflect on that when Mitchell's finished.
I got out in '89, so when I think about it, both those documents came out. I think one of them at least came out after it. So we had discussed it then. It was
Yeah.
towards the loss in peace, I think, was the second one, and scenario for peace. So that was discussed in GL, yeah.
Right, you might just give us your thought now at the moment. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Mark.
No, it's Kevin them ag an art call you nor a vimmer a play a drobo and shiafana grow instant documentation grow mer a lagan amok roll realtas na hair and mar hampler roll ahan Daniela agus gur curmer ag an art call you an amshin just linia wine a stock a glorch for méid a bheits Virginia Janet agus go lani Virginia rai a géirí siad an
By Shannon and more that the Irish government had to come before that. The notion of idea for people that thought about it was, the IRA and the British come to some sort of arrangement, and then there's big constitutional convention and so on. But in this major policy shift, and you were very instrumental in that, Mitchell, it was that we were putting the onus on the Irish government to come front and centre and deal with the British government.
Yeah, in a sense, where you referenced the other way in which the word peace and the concept of peace had been weaponised by the opponents of Irish republicanism, and the implication there was that everybody except Irish Republicans was interested in peace. The party adopted a campaign slogan coming out of the hunger strike period of freedom, justice and peace. And out of that then came the various amplifications that you are referring to. The issue or the idea of how you would achieve that immediately challenged Republicans, like on issues like, well, do you think you can continue the struggle until you defeat the British government on your own and then peace will follow? Or does it require that you build alliances, that you begin to explore the concepts of peace and national democracy that others might have? And that groundwork started in the very early 80s. It was a very slow process. And when you consider that these kind of documents, these core documents of our strategy, it took the best part of 10 years before people then started to either examine and analyse what we were saying or even to challenge what we were saying, which we were content enough with. We wanted a dialogue, and we believed out of that, for instance, the talks, and they turned out to be hugely significant between the SDLP and Sinn Féin in the latter part of the 80s. Each meeting was, we were kind of passing papers to each other back and forward, mainly outlining what we disagreed with each other. But there then was a task when the talks came to their natural conclusion, where the papers were examined and distilled down to about 8 points of agreement, is my memory. That is, 8 points where we had a common position with the SDLP, and all the other reams of paper simply outlined the reasons why we disagreed with each other. And that was the basis of a discussion that developed then between you and John Hume that eventually led or completely kind of influenced the emergence of the Downing Street Declaration, where John Major put it down as formal British policy that the people of Ireland were entitled to self-determination. So it was an evolutionary process rather than a revolutionary one.
Okay, I just want to go back a wee bit, and then I'm going to invite Gerry to come in. First of all, Sinn Féin was not, it was the poor second cousin. The IRA was the main sort of organisation of struggle. Sinn Féin was very sound and very solid and did great work. But one of our objectives was to grow Sinn Féin as an all-Ireland radical Republican party. Secondly, we were censored. Those big policy changes going through the RDS were largely unnoticed by the media. They weren't picked up. So, part of the problem that Mitchell said it took 10 or 12 years, that's because people didn't know they were being denied their right to whatever was happening within the Republican camp. And then finally, before we bring Gerry back, Father Des Wilson and Father Alex Reid picked up on this. Now, they were two priests based in West Belfast, so they were in the heart of the Republican community. They knew what was going on. They knew the victimisation, the occupation, all the rest of it. And they picked up, particularly on this big mantra for us was, if you want the IRA to stop, give them an alternative. Right? Talk, listen, dialogue. That was, and they played a huge role, very diligently over a couple of decades actually, trying to get that across. So Gerry, you're in prison, that these matters were discussed. What?
God love me.
I know. So these matters were discussed by the prisoners, and then you come out, and maybe you would take us to Martin yourself were involved in.
Yeah. Well, when I got out in 1989, I suppose it was because I think it was evolution, and sometimes we talk about watersheds, and it's quite difficult to work out even in this conversation. So what was a watershed? But I certainly think that the hunger strike was a watershed and accepted by everybody because of the impact. And we may not have known the impact because we were dealing with an issue, which was what was happening in jail. But something strikes me a way back, because it has always stuck in my head. There was a document came out, I think it was around 1977, somewhere around there, I might get these dates wrong, from the General Glover, who was the head of the British here. And the document was leaked or found or whatever it was, and it said that they could not defeat the IRA. And I think that, because it was read at the time, I think, by anybody probably who was in jail or who had been involved in the conflict, it was read by, yeah, absolutely, they can't defeat us. But the flip side of that, of course, was that it couldn't be a defeat either way, right? And I think that in itself, led a small path in terms of that. Then when the hunger strikes came, and we had long since decided not to be involved in electoral politics, and then this huge issue, as well as being macro on a very personal basis, these were comrades and all of that there. Then when we stepped into electoralism, you couldn't turn back. I mean, in my opinion, that's what it was now. You might have been able to, but it kicked off, as somebody said earlier in the conversation, in terms of that. I think then to head towards me getting out and all of that, I got it in 1989. Certainly the policy, and I think we learned this very quickly during the negotiations, but the policy of the British, there was no policy. I mean, I had in my head, these are, when we were stepping into this, these guys have, 2,000 years of expertise and all of that, and what you found out was actually their policy was inertia. They had a notion that the best way to deal with this was containment, and actually they had a military mentality. I'm not talking about the British Army, I'm talking about the state in terms of that. And I think trying to move through that was difficult. I got out in 1989 fairly quickly after Gerry Adams let me take a wee holiday. I became involved with the prisoners department and then until the publicity department and that. And I was very honoured. I mean, I was very privileged to be asked to accompany Martin to a meeting with the British government representative. Of course, there was, which I didn't know at the time, but learned, there was sporadic, if you like, contact from the British over a long number of years. Did
that include when Thatcher was in power?
As far as I remember, but I only learned this. I mean, so you would know perhaps better. But there was certainly, and Martin had been at the centre of that. And of course, it would go right back to the early 70s when there was talks. Anyway, I was asked to go. We went to Derry in a very difficult situation. The Warrington bomb had taken place. This had been arranged, and there was supposed to be 2 people came, only one turned up, but we did the meeting, and I took a note of the meeting, and I do remember that the representative was saying things like, and coming from a British representative made this the important thing, there's going to be union, this is all heading towards union of the United Ireland, the unionists have to realise that. And as I was taking notes, I was thinking, I wasn't thinking that this was a seminal moment, but I was thinking there's something going on here that I was never expecting. When it was brought back to the team, which had already been set up in terms of talks and all of that, my memory of it, and others here might have their own view of it, but my memory of it was, the analysis was, that's really interesting. And this is about talks and being able to set up delegation talks, but it needs to be brought out in the open. I always remember that, I forget who said it, but I always remember You know, they can talk in private rooms, but there needs to be a public, if you like, manifestation, not of that meeting, because the back channel was always important, but that this had to be brought out to the open so it could be discussed, rather than the small group was there at the time, and then all republicanism and that. So I do think it was a very important moment, but I didn't necessarily know that at the time, to be honest. I think then there was other important moments which added to that. But that's my memory of the first action. Then we were meeting in houses. There's no trust of having quiet conversations, so you were shifting with place to house. And then the next, for me personally, then I was actually at a wedding in '94, my niece's wedding in Devonish, and I got a phone call to come down to the Sevastopol Street, and we were starting on a platform and being announced as the team who was getting in, at least to the first meeting, because the group got much bigger, of course, and the group was already big. Got into the first meeting in Stormont, and I remember going up to that. It was Lucelita, Sean McManus, myself, Martin obviously, and Siobhan O'Hanlon. And I had a briefcase which had nothing in it, and a Dexter.
A Dexter.
And no trousers?
No, I managed to get the trousers on. But it was bizarre in a certain way, and you could feel there was an atmosphere, because it was mostly police that were there and all of that. There was an atmosphere of what are these characters doing up here, I also remember that the first meeting there was quite a team of across the table of civil servants, top civil servants. I think John Chilcott was the top civil servant at the time who decided not to come. And he sent Quentin Thomas, who was the permanent secretary, I think, in the NIO. And it became, I think, very clear over a couple of meetings, if not the first meeting, that they were using it to stall the process as opposed to deal with the real issues. And that didn't really change. We did a number of meetings, and it was, fencing across the table, but it didn't change. Later, maybe at the time, I think there was certainly a realization that there was a conservative a minority government, and they need the Unionists. The Unionists were absolutely against talking to Republicans, and that had an impact. So they started bringing up barriers as opposed to trying to move it. And I'm jumping a wee bit, and I'll stop with this. When Tony Blair got in, the Labour Party came with a huge majority. It not exactly overnight, but near enough. Once they settled down, got up and running. The first meeting under the Labour Party, the absolute first meeting, the exact same civil servants. To my memory, there wasn't one changed. Right, started talking entirely in an entirely different atmosphere about where we were going, and you knew you were into real talks. That's my memory of it.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back. Thank you, Gerry. I'm going to go back just a wee bit. So, the party had developed these different strategies and policy positions, and we were looking at negotiations as a mode of struggle and how you can use negotiations in that way. And Mitchel and Bairbre have touched upon the other people that we were in touch with, particularly Mitchel, giving us the outline of the SDLP talks. But there was other contacts with the Irish government. There had been ongoing, though not with leaders, contacts with people from a unionist background. There was this back channel with the British, and it did happen when Thatcher was there. It had come back, it had been used in '74 then during the hunger strikes, and then when you and Martin were involved. And then, of course, we had developed strategic objectives, which included the need to reach out to people internationally. So on the one hand, we reached out to the ANC for advice, but on the other hand, we reached out to our own diaspora in Irish America. And I think what's very, very important in all of this, which rarely gets mentioned, like in relation to the role of the IRA and so on. The IRA never came to any formal arrangement with the British government on anything. What we did as Sinn Féin was to develop with others an alternative to armed actions. And then it was an independent, if you like, Irish-American type of an initiative. We went to the freedom fighters and we said, look, we now think there's an alternative. But let's go back a wee bit, just maybe your recollections on context.
But I also remember, just in terms of those contexts, they were obviously the big major contexts, but that was about that time that I moved from being a local activist that was on the Ard Comhairle to then moving out in the international department, going abroad to promote the peace process, and North America obviously, and Canada, and so there were the Irish diaspora, but also right throughout Europe, progressive parties, then also meeting with people from who were also sending out feelers from other governments, some I think on behalf of the British and some just for their own, to know what was happening here and what was likely and what was possible. So there was an awful lot of that building international opinion, which was part of those strategic objectives, so that the voices grew from quite a broad range of people, that the change was possible here and that the British needed to take it seriously.
So what's your recollection, thank you Bairbre, what's your recollection then of this changing situations? Obviously the war is still going on, obviously the prisons are still full, there's still all of the difficulties that we're very aware of. But there's now, a very active Sinn Féin push for our growing mandate to be recognised and for there to be all-party talks and for nobody to be barred from those talks. What was your recollection of the Irish government's response, the British government's response? And also, and each of you want, just jump in if you have a recollection of how some of that developed.
Yeah.
And talk about the unionists as well, if you want.
I have referenced the hunger strike and the mobilisations and the role of support organisations like the Relatives Action Committee, not just what they were doing on the island of Ireland, because they went over to Britain. They went to Europe and addressed the European Parliament. They went to the States and addressed congressmen and senators. They briefed one of the key kind of journalists, syndicated journalists, Jimmy Breslin. It was an international story which was actually much more nuanced than, the IRA are bad and the British government is defending the civilian population. Because the story of the hunger strike is the heroism of the hunger strike itself, but that hunger strikers could stand in elections and that the electors would actually elect them. Not only opened up a whole new avenue of struggle for Republicans, but it contradicted in the most graphic way the propaganda that this was a small marginalised group of terrorists, who are going to...
If I could come in just saying that, to my memory, and I might be wrong, I think it was the guy, Peter J. There was a guy who was World at One or something, and he was Callahan's son-in-law, if I remember this correctly. And he was sent over to America either as the ambassador or sent over particularly to try and counteract. He sacked a lot of the people who were involved in the publicity for the British in America to try and counteract. And what they couldn't counteract was simply that, was set all propaganda, newspapers and all aside, was a question, well, why are these people prepared to give up their lives if necessary? And he failed in that. That was to me, in a way, the first time we broke through, if you like, the paper wall or whatever you might have called it of our newspapers.
Well, the consequence of that kind of development was that Irish governments became actively involved, possibly out of self-interest, but they also maybe recognised that here maybe was a way out of conflict as well. And that goes back to Charlie Haughey authorising meetings involving us, Bairbre picking up on it. Albert Reynolds, I think, if it hadn't been for Albert Reynolds, John Major would not have put out the Down the Street Declaration. Those kind of things have to be acknowledged by Republicans as well. So there was a coming together of common interest. If we could recreate that now in terms of moving to the next step of say, citizens' assemblies and discussing referendums, you know, it's the logical next step. But I think we should learn important lessons about how we can mobilise, even sometimes against their own self-interest, all of the Irish nationalist kind of parties on what would be the final resolution of this conflict. The conflict, despite the Good Friday Agreement, continues. The war is over, but the conflict is continuing.
We shouldn't forget the people in Britain who
supported it.
Who stuck their necks out to talk out openly about what was happening here, and who brought it into Irish centres, brought it into trade union halls, and I imagine that although they were quite small and continued to be quite small, perforce being right in the capital of the people who didn't want to hear what they had to say, but I often wonder as well how much the British Labour Party would have even started to grasp some of the things they'd have grasped strategically where they felt they needed to be, but how much they would have grasped some of the arguments without people like that had done all of that long-standing legwork before them.
Okay, we're coming sort of naturally to a break because we're trying to set the scene. I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. This is a very Sinn Féin focused recollection, but it would be remiss of us not to appreciate the role of John Hume.
Yeah.
That as we develop what became known as Hume Adams, that he stuck with it, and that the broad principles which we had developed, you know, in terms of the importance, the centrality of self-determination to give the people their choice.
And we shouldn't forget the intense kind of and vitriolic criticism that he got for even engaging in those conversations.
And then, because I want to start writing this, but I want to ask you very specific questions, right? So we're playing now on their side of the field, and we're saying talk, discuss, and wait. This podcast doesn't have the time to deal with the detail of all of that, but we've worked out quite sensible, reasonable positions. And here was Major saying it would turn his stomach to talk to Sinn Féin, while, as Gerry has indicated, they were already through a back channel talking to us. Or he talked about, you know, Sinn Féin needed to be decontaminated. You know, and then we had the people coming forward from Irish America, the people we call them the Common Irish Group. Some of you met them in the course of it. They became household names at that time. So what's your sense of two things, just what was happening within unionism, number one, and then secondly, what was happening within the broad Republican base, you know, the not necessarily even the activist base, but the general, as these things were developing and so on. So whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I mean, if you deal with the base first, and I did quite a lot of going around the country with others, you know, did a lot of going around the country. I think they caught on. You have to generalise, you know. So there's all sorts of different views, and you know, don't be talking to Brits till you're doing the right thing and all of that. But I certainly always found that once you get into a conversation, that people knew that what the leadership was doing, they may, and sometimes it's portrayed like this, you're putting your toe into the issue, you're testing it with caution. And I think actually that always helped, you know, that people thought, well, they're going to be careful. You know, they're taking a chance here, but they're going to be careful. I found, certainly in my own experience anyway, that people realised that there was a chance here. They mightn't even have been able to articulate how far it would go or whatever. But at the base of it as well, I mean, the other thing in people's head is they did not want the conflict to go on forever. They did want to see that it was going to come to some sort of conclusion. And for Republicans, as I think somebody said earlier, to have retaken the issue of peace, if you like, who have reclaimed it as if it didn't belong to us, that peace means something to everybody, I think was catching on substantially. To allow, I don't want to exaggerate because this was early days, to allow for the conversations to continue. And one of the lessons we learned, of course, from the South Africans, and think of the size of their country, right, was that your biggest negotiation will be with your base.
Yeah.
And I think that was something which was said so often.
We said it all the
that
time to remind ourselves.
that it became a part, and even the discussion around which I remember around the strategic objectives was, I think that discussion in itself was a huge step forward because it stood by us through thick and thin, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Mitchel to give his reflections, and then we'll give the focal score to Bairbre, and we take a pause there.
We talked at the beginning of this about the just how long it took to get to the point where people were negotiating with each other. There's a lot of testing going on, maybe a lot of skepticism on both sides. One of the things that actually made me realise that there had been a significant change in British policy, long-standing British policy, that it would never be in England's interest to withdraw from Ireland. That's what was governing their approach to Ireland for 70 odd years. But then we had the Peterborough Statement, which was authorised by Thatcher, of all people, of all the British Prime Ministers you could think about, authorised by Thatcher. It was eventually repeated by John Major, even though Jim Molyneux in the Unionist Party had his cabinet by the throat. He had a majority of 2. It couldn't function.
Yeah.
Couldn't do any of the other things that the British government needed to do without the support of the Unionist Party. We had to develop an understanding of that. And I would now, on reflection, give Major some credit for not killing off the, this kind of newly born peace process, which he could surely have done. The business of his stomach turning over and all of that could have caused some Republicans to walk away and say, you're wasting your time talking to those people. But at the end of the day, he did issue and signed it jointly with Albert Reynolds, the Downing Street Declaration, which is now reflected in the Good Friday Agreement. So even with our enemies, and he certainly was an enemy, there was, I think, some of the stuff that was coming out of the British Army, confidential kind of studies about not being able to defeat the IRA, where we were meant to hear about them. They were meant to influence Republicans. If they were thinking about peace, then maybe we'll all start talking about peace. And I think those kind of birth pains were very painful, but I do think that eventually we ended up talking Turkey.
Well, I wouldn't give John Major as much credit as you, but that's another day's work. So Bairbre, what was happening? We've looked at all the different sort of sectors here, at least some of them anyway. What was happening within unionism, and is it, for example, when the IRA actually went into a SUS, went into a cessation, what's your sense of what was going on within the unionist section of our people?
I think it was multi-layered. I think some of the unionist politicians were so wedded to the idea of getting us off whatever path was bringing us closer to other people that was really all that they could think about. I suppose the strongest example of that was Molyneux, who thought that the ceasefire was the most destabilising thing that had happened.
And Molyneux was the leader of the Ulster Union Party at the time.
He was, yeah.
And it was the biggest party at the time.
It was. But there were whole other layers of unionist society. I mean, we were talking to people within the churches, we were talking to people within civil society in that section of the population. They were obviously had big differences with us in a lot of the discussions that we had, but they were very much in favour of embracing the road and the move forward. I also remember just at very local level there were people within peace groups. I mean, I remember going out to speak at one out around Lisburn, and there was a guy on the platform who's one of the unionist ministers today, as in political ministers, DUP ministers. Needless to say, he wasn't on the platform at the same time I was, or I wasn't on the platform at the same time he was. And his contribution to, you know, the possible outreach at that time was he who lives by the sword shall die by the sword. But I then, when it came my turn, said my bit on the platform, and people come up to me afterwards and very clearly within Union society didn't have that same starkness. Although some then, and I think some today, I think we have to acknowledge people who were hurt by Republicans and who did think that that peace meant everybody who'd hurt them getting their comeuppance and then being okay. A lot of people at that stage were confused about where the peace process was leading and where they were going to be. Because I remember even having a discussion with them at that stage. But surely, whatever came out of this, if it meant nobody else was going to go through that, wherever they came from in part of our society, was that not a good thing? And a lot of the unionists that we were talking to, whether they were organised by groups within that community or within some of the people that you talked about before, Alex Reid, or those, you know, organising for people to come together and to talk. It was very clear there were a lot of the unionist population that were very, very much wedded to this.
And you may have said this, but what was it that Molyneux said about the IRA cessation?
His view of it was that it was the most destabilising thing that had happened.
Right. So that gives you an insight that, you know, that peace was seen by him as almost threatening, or the potential for peace. There wasn't peace at that time, of course.
Yes, it was. I mean, there was no doubt that there were a section of the unionists. It certainly wasn't all of them, but there was a section, particularly within, as you say, even the biggest unionist party, whose view was anything that got out of there will be absolute victory for unionism, because unionism has never done anything wrong, and they're the ones that did things wrong. There was undoubtedly a large section of unionism that was wedded to that, because they couldn't countenance the possibility that they might have been part of what went wrong. But that wasn't uniform at all in terms of the general population. It was more nuanced, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Mitchel just to give you a brief recollection of the talks that he was involved in with different elements of civic unionism.
Yeah, and I mean, my experience was that there was a very broad spectrum of opinions about the future when you were talking to people who were undoubtedly unionists, who intended to continue to be unionists, but had, you know, perhaps with the experience of being in business or in some of the kind of the church organisations, were prepared to concede that nationalists and Republicans also had rights. Molyneux, in my kind of understanding of his political complexion, was an integrationist. He wanted to get as close as possible to the British state, and he was quite content for that to be the identity and the aspiration of everybody else. Otherwise, you know, he wouldn't have got involved in talking about alternative democratic solutions. But you always were able to find people who were prepared to kind of examine these issues. My difficulty and frustration over the years was that sometimes these people actually turned into gatekeepers, because they couldn't find an entree into that conversation that would not have been threatening within their own constituency. So our conversations sometimes, and our energy that we put into those engagements, didn't actually go anywhere practical, but it would be wrong to say that none of it travelled. I think the conversation that we were already deeply involved in about finding, to use the expression that we've used in publications, the pathway to peace, people recognised that there was that possibility, and that you know, those who were insisting on outright victory on either side we're simply just prolonging the struggle.
Okay, well, look, that brings us to the quick, to the end of this week's podcast. And I said at the beginning, this is a partisan view. I mean, it's looking at what was happening within republicanism, within Sinn Féin. But now we're just going to leap in our next podcast into the actual beginning of the formal negotiations. A lot of what had been happening thus far was below the surface, or was being done as Gerry and Bairbre and Mitchel have described it. So thanks for your input, Gura Míle Mág, and we'll be back next week with a thrilling account of the castle buildings drama. Thank you. Gura Míle Mág.